This episode is brought to you by Nebula. If you'd like to help support Second Thought, and the Deprogram, and First Thought, consider signing up for Nebula at the link below. So, Socialism. It's not America's favorite thing.
Socialism.
America will never be a socialist country.
It's like if you had two cows, right? And then the government. Ask any American, and they'll tell you this large field of corn we call the US has always been a capitalist country. Ask socialists for that matter. It's honestly pretty difficult to look at the history of the most powerful capitalist country that's ever existed and say otherwise. Whether it's the Red Scare or the Cold War, not to mention all the CIA-backed coups abroad, the US has obviously got a capitalist, anti-communist thing going. And if you watched the last episode, you know that this is something the right likes to weaponize. In this country, progressive ideas are discredited by being labeled Marxism. Marxism gets labeled un-American, and un-American things get labeled destructive, or even evil. It's one of the ways conservatives stigmatize the left's politics, by saying they aren't from here, and that makes them bad and scary.
I will order my government to deny entry to all communists and all Marxists. Those who come to and join our country must love our country. We want them to love our country. We don't want them when they want to destroy our country. Welcome to America. We want to destroy your country. Thank you very much.
But in this episode, we're going to challenge this idea. While the US has never been governed by a socialist party, that's true, it's not true that socialism isn't a big part of this country's history. And not just because of the Red Scares. Let's start at the beginning. Quick disclaimer before we actually begin, this couldn't in any way be a complete history of socialism in the US. There's just way too much for one video, which kinda tells you everything already. But anyway. Before settler colonists showed up, North America had quite a bit of socialism already. Native Americans, and I'm very much generalizing here, organized advanced societies on this continent oftentimes along pretty socialistic lines, meaning things like collective ownership and management of economic resources, environmental stewardship instead of resource extraction, intra-clan democracy, and multi-clan democratic federations.
It was socialistic, the indigenous socialism collectively. This is why native property wasn't recognized, because it was collectively owned.
That's Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, by the way. She's the author of this book. In it, among other things, she talks about how indigenous nations like the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, organized along more socialistic and democratic lines than you might expect. Dunbar Ortiz specifically mentions how this allowed Native Americans to thrive for centuries, when, by contrast, some European colonizers in the early 1600s had to resort to cannibalism and coprophagy. Please don't Google that word. According to this famous book by Howard Zinn. Not only was all this happening right here, it's been argued by historians, and even recognized by Congress, that the Haudenosaunee Constitution actually influenced parts of the US Constitution. So beyond just happening in the same place, this history had some bearing on our current government. Though, admittedly, not that much, because, well, we'll get to that. Anyway. Calling pre-European America socialist is a bit of a stretch, no doubt about it. North American societies before the Crackening were incredibly different from one another. They had important shortcomings relative to contemporary socialist politics. And socialism would just have to look very different today, post-industrial revolution. It's interesting, and to this day, socialist politics continue to inspire indigenous activism in the US, with groups like the Red Nation, for example. And vice versa. Marx's ideas of communism, particularly later in his life, drew inspiration from Native American politics. While the Native American genocide did a lot to limit this influence, the US's place in socialist history is actually pretty important. But it obviously doesn't stop there. Let's fast forward a bit to the 1800s. In the US, the early 1800s were a bit of an experimental time for socialists. All across the country, a number of communities sprang up following utopian socialist principles, meaning experiments in creating socialist societies within capitalism. No overthrowing. There was Robert Owen's New Harmony in Indiana, George and Sophia Ripley's Brook Farm in Massachusetts, the North American Phalanx in New Jersey. The Shakers had communities all over the US, and you get the idea. These small communities were organized according to a number of socialist principles, like equality and communality. and they developed around the same time as, slightly before, famous socialist theorists Proudhon and Marx started their inquiry into capitalism and socialism. Rather impressively, some of these experiments lasted quite a long time, however, never at a very large scale. In parallel, though, you had the organized labor movement. From the 1820s to the 1860s, union organizations began to pop up all over the place, and started gaining a national scope. First with the National Printers Union, then other unions of craft workers, then trades assemblies and councils and federations, all of which brought unions together under one big umbrella. In 1881, craft unions established the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions of the United States and Canada, and eventually they realized long names are dumb, and they renamed it to the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which actually still exists. Today, in 2023, the AFL-CIO is the largest union federation in the US, at 12.5 million members. And although there's a lot to say about it, both then and now, its place in American socialist history is incredibly important, as we'll see in a second. Around this time, you also had massive organizations like the Knights of Labor, which started in 1869 as a secret pro-labor society for workers and non-workers. By 1886, it had grown to over 700,000 members in just over 15 years. And if the date 1886 feels familiar to you, that might be because it's the year of the Haymarket Massacre. If you've never heard about it before, Haymarket was a key moment in socialist history, when several hundreds of thousands of workers from the AFL and the Knights and other organizations went on strike to demand the 8-hour workday all across the US. And in Chicago, at Haymarket Square, they were met with police officers' bullets. Because at this time, socialist and anarchist politics were not just well established in workers' movements, those movements were now well organized and, most importantly, they were big. Just massive unions. This frightened the American ruling class of industrial capitalists, which, up to that point, you can imagine was pretty happy paying workers close to nothing and making them clock 60-hour work weeks. Anyway, at Haymarket, on May 1st, 1886, one of these 8-hour workday strikes was met by industrialist-funded, brutal police repression. Officers shot and killed 2 striking workers, and in response, workers organized a rally to protest police violence. Officers ordered them to disperse, and a still unknown striker threw an explosive at them. It detonated, killed an officer, and what followed was a full-on shootout that led to the death of 10 more people and the injury of over 70. That summer, 8 prominent Chicago anarchists were put on trial for the death of the police officers involved, and 7 of them were executed. Today, that strike, the massacre, and the executions are the big reasons we have International Workers' Day on May 1st. It's celebrating the struggles of workers and socialists for working people's rights. But Haymarket is by no means unique in terms of repression. The late 19th century is when police and military repression of socialists, anarchists, and workers in general really picked up in this country. It's a testament to how popular socialist and labor politics were in the US that 10 years before Haymarket, in 1877, wealthy Chicago citizens raised $28,000, over $800,000 in today's money, to arm the city's police force with rifles, cannons, cavalry equipment, and a Gatling gun? This is kind of shocking, but not really unique either. Basically, the only reason there was a police force in most major cities in the US was because wealthy capitalists wanted a standing, strike-breaking force, in a country where the working class was actively resisting its subordinate role in the social hierarchy. Class war isn't just a euphemism. Employers actively made sure they were well enough armed to wage war against their employees when they complained. It's also at this time that state and federal military forces joined in on the strike breaking, notably in Chicago again during the 1894 Pullman strike. Around 11,000 state and federal troops joined forces with over 3,000 police officers to brutalize striking Pullman workers, whose wages had just been slashed from 25% to 33%, while their rent in a Pullman company town stayed the same. And tell me if this starts to feel familiar, 8 years earlier, industrialists had raised $156,000, $5 million today, for a fort a few miles north of Chicago to make sure the military could quickly enter the city. But let's fast forward again. The 20th century is probably the time where there's the most socialist enthusiasm in US history. But that also means it's when there was the most anti-socialist repression. Undoubtedly, for this kind of video, the 20th century has to start with Eugene V. Debs. Between 1900 and 1920, Debs ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket, going from less than 100,000 votes all the way up to nearly 1 million in 1920 when he ran after denouncing World War I. Debs was one of the founders of the IWW. He was a leader during the Pullman strikes. He delivered speeches and wrote for the abolition of prisons and property, against racism and inequality and war. Basically every part of American socialism after Debs is marked by this guy. And his massive popularity in a country that actively repressed labor militancy and only has room for 2 political parties who serve the same capitalist interests is a huge testament to the socialist base that's existed here for centuries. But beyond the figure of Debs, who is important, don't get me wrong, it's also important to highlight the victories of the socialist and worker movements as a whole, because there were a lot of them. Usually, when we tell the history of the 20th century, a lot of change gets labeled progress without actually acknowledging how that progress happened. Because a lot of the time, the answer was socialists going out there, shutting down the economy, and burning stuff until things got better. Early 20th century socialist and worker victories included things like ending child labor in the US, securing the right to unionize and strike, the federal minimum wage, and to some extent, most of FDR's New Deal. The New Deal created Social Security, a sort of jobs guarantee, and the 40-hour workweek, and that's despite the fact that FDR wasn't a socialist. The big reason the New Deal happened and was so transformative was because Democrats couldn't handle socialist agitation and worker unrest, and concessions sounded a lot better to them than working-class revolution. Speaking of which, the Red Scare.
If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist.
The 20th century is obviously remembered for the Red Scares. Socialism was popular in the US, and on the other side of the world, in Russia, for basically the first time, socialism had produced a successful national revolution. Hence the Red Scare. In the US, the first Red Scare is mostly remembered for police forces destroying unions all across the country, and the mass imprisonment of members of the IWW. Then there was the second Red Scare after World War II, which pretty much did the same stuff as the first, just more. Government employees, movie writers and directors, academics, politicians, unionists, members of socialist organizations. They were all investigated by the FBI, blacklisted from their industries, and thrown in jail after being put through show trials that sent many into hiding. This brings us to the Panthers and the civil rights movements. Now, socialists had been involved in the movement for racial equality since much earlier in the 20th century than the 60s. For example, in Alabama, where black workers organized in the Communist Party against racial capitalism and their oppression during the 30s and 40s. More about that in this great book, by the way. But undoubtedly, the civil rights movement is definitely when this becomes a front and center part of socialist organizing. At the heart of the movement, you have MLK, a socialist, leading the charge. Put some quotes on screen right now. He was a commie. That's just who he was. You also had the Black Panthers, who were even more explicitly commie. They organized free health clinics and breakfasts in black communities, monitored police brutality, advocated for socialism and women's liberation, and got absolutely steamrolled by the FBI and the COINTELPRO assassination program. You also had the gay liberation and feminist movements gaining ground around the same time, and they too had a strong anti-capitalist element to them in their attacks on patriarchy and heteronormativity. Then there's the anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal protest of the 90s. Then Occupy, then BLM, then Bernie, then BLM again, and on and on. To summarize this whole video, basically, at any point in US history you want to look, you'll find incredibly popular socialist movements, even at a cursory glance in a short video like this. And when you consider the effect these movements had on society, the rights they clawed from capitalist hands, it's impossible not to see socialism as a huge part of why the US is the way it is. In a good way, like we have a weekend and children aren't in the mines anymore. Socialists have historically been responsible for pushing the progressive wing of the political ruling class to compromise, because when they didn't, the working class in this country fought back. All this to say that socialist politics aren't some kind of new thing, nor some un-American foreign import. Not that either of those should be a bad thing. It's just that socialism is so well established here, and has been for so long, that you couldn't possibly keep pretending that the US doesn't have a proper socialist history. It's simply been forced back time and again by the brutal agents of capital. This ideology is no more imported than Adam Smith's or John Locke's ideas of liberal capitalism. But like Marx said, the dominant ideas of every era are the ideas of the ruling class. And the ruling class doesn't want to give up the wealth and power they accumulated and built an entire system around way back in their bourgeois revolution against the British. Socialist thought is still here. As much as it's been beaten down, lied about, and forced out of our collective memory by intense and ongoing propaganda campaigns. All we need to do is remember that legacy, learn from the successes and failures of the past, and get involved. You have a branch of a socialist organization near you. Join it. Whether it's CPUSA, PSL, FRSO, DSA, whatever, just get involved. I've left links in the description. Socialist power comes from masses of people standing up to oppression. Let's make it happen. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that this video was made possible by Nebula. I'm sure you're all aware of Nebula by now. It's the creator-owned streaming platform that's home to content from all your favorite creators, where we can make the content we really want to make. What you might not know is that you can find not just Second Thought on Nebula, but also First Thought and the Deprogram. If you've ever listened to the Deprogram, you understand why it's always demonetized. That's why I'm so glad we have Nebula. We can be honest, we can have fun, we can produce content for people to enjoy without having to choose our words carefully to avoid age restriction or demonetization. The three of us at the Deprogram are toying with the idea of making a highly produced Nebula original series in a similar style to Blowback, doing a deep dive into an interesting topic in socialist history. But that will only be possible if we can prove there's enough interest. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, let us know in the comments below, and sign up for Nebula to show there's an audience for the series. Here's the heartfelt part. Every person who signs up using my link is directly contributing to the financial stability of this operation. That's Second Thought, the Deprogram, and First Thought. None of this would be possible without the generosity of viewers like you, especially since pretty much all my sponsors have bailed. And it doesn't take a huge investment to help keep the lights on. If you sign up with the link below, you'll get access to Nebula, and you'll be directly supporting your 3 favorite socialist creators. The annual plan is just $30 for an entire year. I honestly think that's an amazing deal for all the great content on Nebula. So if you'd like to help support our work, and get access to the streaming platform built and owned by the creators, sign up for Nebula using my link below. It really does help support me and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can watch my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.